Now I'm going to be showing you some pretty cool techniques for making science fiction textures. We're going to start out by creating our base texture. So I'm going to create a new document, and the size you want to use is entirely up to you, although some of Photoshop's commands and filters and such are limited to a specific size. In this case, it might be easier to use something a little smaller for the base texture. So I'm going to start with 1024 by 1024 pixels, pretty standard resolution. Sometimes a little bit higher might be needed, but just as our base texture, we'll start with this. I have background set transparent. Either way, we're going to fill it in with a different color, so it really doesn't matter. And I'm going to use the 8-bit mode to start out with this. So what I want to do is fill in and pick kind of a darker gray to start out with, and just fill in that layer. And I'm going to add a new layer and just pick another color slightly lighter. I'm up to 139 RGB all the way across. We'll fill that in. And there's a couple of filters we can use to make paneling and stuff that's useful for this kind of base layer. So if we go up to filter, and underneath stylize, there's the tiles filter, and this will create tiles across the document, basically splitting up whatever layer you have. In this case, we're just using a solid background, and in this case I am going to make sure that the background and foreground colors are a little more different than they currently are. We'll go back to filter, stylize, select tiles, and now what we can do is specify the amount of tiles. Basically, that's going to tile both horizontally and vertically. So it is more of a symmetrical appearance. The maximum offset amount is going to create a separation between the tiles. For a consistent amount, you would use a value of 1%. 10% is going to have a little more overlapping overall. We're going to be using a combination of different settings in order to get some more interesting layers we can basically stack on top of each other. So with just the default settings, we can see the separation changes throughout the overall layer. We'll go ahead and create a new layer, fill it in, go back, and select tiles again. This time I'm going to choose a higher amount for the tile. I'm going to set it to 43. So we're going to have 43 tiles going across both vertically and horizontally. And I'm going to set the maximum offset to 1% and click OK. So now we have a nice little tile background, very uniform. Because of the value I set, it might be difficult to use this for seamless. I'm going to go ahead and just delete that, create a new layer. So we are going to use an even number. It really depends on what you're going to be doing with it. We are going to be overlaying these, so it might not matter too much, but I do want something pretty close for a tiling texture, and something that's going to be easier to make seamless. So we just have created 40. I'm going to go ahead and create another new layer. And the color we're using really doesn't matter right now. We can always change that later. Go back to our stylize tiles, and this time I'm going to increase it to 50. And it'll give us a little bit of a different offset amount. So some different sizes that we can overlay on top of each other and give some pretty neat effects out of it overall. So what I'm going to do is create a copy of this first tile I made and set this to the lighten mode. Nothing's really going to show up at this point because it is exactly the same lightness all throughout. So I'm going to use the number keys on the keyboard to basically nudge the document or the layer by a pixel amount. every single time we hit up, it's going to move the document. And you want to make sure that you're clicking out of the layer style after this point. The best way to make sure that it's unselected is really just grab the layer, and you really don't even have to move it. So you could even just click on it sometimes, and that'll work. And that way, we're back to the document, select the Move tool, and we can just arrow that up a bit. And this one I want to have just a small separation vertically. And we'll go ahead and create another copy of this layer. And now we can bring it off to the side, pull that up a bit, maybe bring it a little bit closer, just to give us a neat little pattern we can use as part of the background. And almost more of like a grading, something like that. So we can hold down Shift and select these three layers that we have now. Control E to merge down, or you can go to Layer, Merge Layers. Because we're not going to need the other ones anymore. We have such a simple filter that if we do need to recreate that layer, then it would be really easy to reapply the command. Now there's a pretty cool trick. What we can do is make a copy of this current layer and setting it to the difference mode and then moving it will give us another pattern to choose from, really depending on what we want this background to look like. So of course there's no set way entirely for what we can create with this. There are different ways we can manipulate this pattern to really end up with something different in the background. So we're really just working with our base layers, so we could do that if we wanted to add to it. But I'm going to stick with what I have right now because it's really a combination of just making a bunch of different layers and picking different layer styles to overlay them on top of each other. Okay, so if we go back, and I'm just going to turn off that layer we were just working on, now we have this more panel type look. Because the tiles themselves are going to be completely square, if you want to make them more rectangular, you can modify free transform the layer, Control T, or using the Marquee Tool, right mouse click and go to free transform. So if you wanted to modify those, bring them out a little bit more, maybe create some different layers or copies of this layer to move over, you could do that as well. Before we go ahead and start manipulating this, I'm going to create one more variation. Go ahead and create a new layer, fill it with our gray color, go back to Filter, Stylize, Tiles, and the number of tiles I'm going to use this time is just going to be 5. The offset amount I'm going to set to 25% and click OK. So now we have another nice pattern we can use. Now if we take a look at the edges, we can really see a huge amount of separation between or compared to what we have in the document for everything else. So depending on if you're going to be using this for a seamless texture as our base layer, then maybe you'd want to modify that. So I'm going to hit Control T to free transform. Just pull that out a little. I'm still going to leave some of that separation on the sides and towards the top. And just hit Enter. So now we have a couple of different things we can work with. And I'm going to start out by creating a new group for backup layers because I do like the way some of these look, and I'm going to be manipulating them in different ways. So in order to preserve the current geometry or the current look of the layer, we can create duplicates. I'm going to modify free transform this other layer before we make a backup of it, just because some of those edge differences might be a little too much. And it looks like we have a pretty consistent line on the right, so we can pull that out, just free transforming. I'm going to select all of our layers, drag them down, make a copy, and move them into the backup. And we can just collapse that for now. Another thing you could do is select the layers, and after you copy them, go up to the top and new group from layers. And that way you don't have to drag them down into the layer or into the group if you're working with a ton of layers. And in most cases with something like this, you're going to end up with a lot of layers, and that could be a bit of scrolling through the document. So it's a good idea to set up different groups. Okay, so the first manipulation I'm going to be doing is removing the white or the lighter color from this layer, and I'm going to be using the magic wand tool. Make sure the continuous mode is off. That way it's going to select every bit of color within the layer and not just whatever is connected to it. Tolerance 5 should be okay. I'm going to have anti-aliasing turned on. I'm going to go ahead and select all of these white areas, and it looks like some of the lines were not selected, so we might need to increase the tolerance. I'm going to bring it up to 25 and go ahead and select, and it looks like it has selected a lot more this time. And if there's any small lines that maybe didn't get selected, you can hold down Shift and add to the selection, and now we are able to select that other color because it was just slightly off and beyond the tolerance. So now what I can do is keep this image we have, or our selection, and we don't have to get rid of it entirely by deleting it. Instead, I'm going to cut it, Control X, Control V to paste it, or you can go to Edit, Cut, and Paste. So now we have them separated, and we'll still be able to use them. And even without making any changes at this point, because of the anti-aliasing, with the selection, we've already created kind of a line around our white areas and the separations between the tiles. So even then, just a simple cut and paste can already make it look a little more interesting. And although we don't want to give it a whole bunch of depth, because we are working with a texture where we're going to use it with a 3D model, then we're not going to want to create too much illusion of depth because we're going to want the model itself to do that, or use a bump map, and we don't want the diffusion or color that we're working on to really manipulate the surface too much where it might not match on the surface you're using it with. So what I want to do now is take basically that base layer we'd made before and drag it underneath our other layers. In this case, if we turned off the white area we removed, we can start to see that showing up in the background. So that can be kind of a cool look. Or we could reverse it. But I'm going to go ahead and turn those on, select just our panels, and change either the opacity amount, or what we could do is maybe change it to a different layer style to get it to blend a little bit better, since we have the exact same color basically on each layer. But really what I want to do is start taking a look at layer styles. There's a lot we can do with layer styles in order to manipulate this, maybe grunge it up a bit if that's the look you're going for. If you want something a bit cleaner, then you might want to restrict the layer style that you're using, at least the amount of depth or the opacity amounts on them, because that might add a little bit too much to the surface. If I double click on the layer that we have our lines that we cut out of our panel layer, we can turn on a drop shadow. I'm going to set the global light to 90 degrees. And if we just increase the distance and the size a little, and set our blend mode to linear burn, and then turn down the opacity, and actually we'll go ahead and set this to color burn, just so it's not as intense. And in this case, it'll make it less uniform. The linear mode is a more uniform look throughout the surface. So if you're looking for something a little more uniform, use the linear mode. And really, depending on the color you end up with in the background, that can affect it too. So now we have just a little bit of shadow underneath. If you wanted, you could increase the distance more and double up the tiles. Increase the size if you wanted to. And this way we kind of have a little bit of grime around the edges of the tiles, or kind of coming down. So that's kind of a neat look. Increase the spread if we wanted to really make the effect more drastic. What I want to do is turn on inner shadow. This will give the illusion of an overlap. Now, whether or not you want that to be part of the texture rather than the model itself is of course up to you. This is something that I think would be better with a normal map rather than using the diffusion or even the bump map, because we don't want to have shadows because that will automatically imply a specific light direction that we want to be able to set within a 3D scene and not determined by the texture itself. So we can remove the distance, and this way we can just line the inside of the layer itself. Whether or not we want to darken it, really up to you. You have a lot of flexibility using the different modes. It's something you can play around with, get some different looks. So you could flip through some of the preset contours, or you can create your own. But you might not want to tweak with it too much, just because it is going to change drastically throughout the changes we're making in the document. So making sure you're not spending too much time on the layer style, just to give a little bit of a difference throughout the surface, and then we can manipulate it later, create different variations, but we just don't want to spend too much time messing around with the layer style. So now I'm going to select the panels layer, and we could drop the shadow, keeping in mind this is really only going to show up just behind the white area. We do have a bit of opacity on, so it will technically show behind the document, but not very much, not enough where it's going to make a big impact. In this case, it just kind of creates almost a stroke around the other panels. So if that's something you're looking for, you could use that. It does make it separate a little bit better. If we turn on the inner shadow mode, we can add a little more to basically that grime that's showing up, where we can mix the shadow from the white cut lines and the current area we are sampling from. So maybe we'd want to use something a little bit smaller, change our distance. I'm going to set this to the color burn. Actually, we'll go ahead and use the linear burn this time, and turn down opacity amount, and just kind of separate that from the surface. We could also turn on the stroke mode, do an inside stroke, increase the size, and now this is going to create obviously something very dark. In this case, we have the color set to black. One thing to keep in mind when you're using the stroke mode is that the opacity will affect not only the stroke, but the layer itself. So if I decrease the opacity, it is going to decrease the opacity of the layer where basically the fill part is not even going to show up. So that is just one thing to keep in mind. We can add a little bit to the surface by using this inside mode. Switching to the outside won't really do much, just because of the design we currently have. The center mode is probably going to work the best for this. So we can go a little bit on the inside and on the outside, have a little more control. If you want to use the gradient type, you can. What would work best is the shape burst mode. Scale with shape burst will not affect anything, neither will the angle. Reverse the direction, and really just kind of play around with it until you get something you like. So one thing I'm going to do now is what we can do is save this document in its current state. You could create another sequence number for it, but what I'm going to do instead is just create a new document from the current state, and that way we can mess around with some of the overlays and basically merging these together, and then we can bring it back to the other document. So I'm going to select all of our layers, even the back, and merge it down. Or what we could do is just go to Layer and select Flatten, which is going to give us a background layer, which is something we can't change the layer style of. So either way you want to do it, it's up to you. What we can do is create a copy, and if we use the exclusion mode, we can get something a little bit different. And I'm going to select the Move tool and just kind of nudge that down or up, bring it to the side a little, and it's something that's a little more washed out. This might be something that works better for a bump map. So being able to use a separate layer style just to extract a bump map could also be useful. So we've got a pretty neat looking surface right now. We'll go ahead and just merge those together, Control E, just going to merge down. And we'll create another copy. Actually this time we'll go to Difference, and we'll go ahead and move that. And now you can see we're creating a very dark look because of the color we had started out with. And you could move that, manipulate it however you want. Of course, in this case, if you merge this, you would want to use brightness and contrast to fix some of the hues or some of the loom values. I'm going to go up to Image Adjustments, select Levels, and what we can do is just pull out some of that detail and maybe see our document a little bit better. And what I also want to do is just remove some of the white. So now we have some pretty neat looking panels, and with the way the overlays are set up, it even looks like we have little bolts around each of the panels. So depending on the layer style you use and the offset, you can create little effects like that. A lot of what you'll end up with could be completely random. You might not know exactly what a layer style is going to do to the image. One thing I suggest, and it's one thing I do all the time, is create duplicates of layers and just run through all of the layer styles. And eventually you get a sense of what each layer style will do, and maybe ahead of time you can know which one to pick. But it's still a good idea to just run through all the layer styles with a duplicate, because you never know what's going to pop out of that. It could be something you like. It could be something that isn't going to work, but at least then you can get a sense of maybe other manipulations you could make and something you might not have thought of. So this would be, although not a completely inverted version with linear dodge add, it does give a different sense of depth and style to the look of the texture. Color dodge looks a little bit better, and then once you find something, it's a good idea to go into the opacity amount and just kind of fine-tune it. So I'm going to stick with that, select the two layers, Control E, merge them, Control A to select the entire canvas. And then copy, go back to our other document, or in this case, I'm just going to create a new document, which is automatically going to take the scale from the previous or the selected layer we just created from the clipboard and set those values. So now we can have a new document, which is basically the same as this other one, but we can always come back to that stored version, or we can create a backup, really depending on how you like to work in the program. It is a good idea to save these out. I currently don't have any of them saved, but that's okay. So you'll want to save the work you're working on, but Photoshop for the most part is pretty stable. So what I want is one of the layers we created earlier, the larger blocks. So we're going to grab that from our other document, and CS4 works a little bit differently than previous versions, where we have basically a set of documents. So just grabbing the layer and trying to move it onto another document doesn't quite work the same. One thing you can do is just kind of pull off the panel from the top to separate from that group, and then take the layer and drag it over, just for something a little quicker and easier rather than using the select all and copy paste. But one disadvantage is, in this case, it's not centered, so we'd have to turn on the snap mode to lock it in place. I'm going to delete the layer, and if we go back where I just minimized that, if we drag this over into a gray area, and what it'll normally do, if the document is the same size, is center it correctly. But what happened is, because we sized the texture without cropping it, then we can't do that. So I'm going to zoom out, select the crop tool, and keeping in mind, now that I'm cropping the entire document, it is going to basically cut out everything outside the document. If you have layer styles, it will affect those if the layer itself is going outside of the bounds of the document. Let's go ahead and give this another try. And it looks like I probably changed one of my settings, so that isn't working. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and move this into place. I'm going to go to View, turn on Snap, making sure you have Snapped Document Bounds turned on. So now we can work with these larger panels. I'm going to do what I did before, using the Magic Wand tool, selecting the white area, cutting it, pasting it. And if it does paste out of place, you can just move that back where it was before. And now what we can do is add a little more dimension to the texture, whether or not we want to have a complete overlay of another document where we've cut out a surface like this using this current panel. We can do that. But what I'm going to do is set our fill amount to 0. What this is going to allow us to do is only show layer styles. So the color we have and the rest of this layer will not show up at all. And it's a little bit different than the opacity amount, because all it's doing is reducing the image itself, but not the layer style. That will be controlled by the opacity. So now we can turn on the layer style and just see, in this case, our drop shadow, or the stroke, or a bevel, if we want to turn that on. So that can be really helpful to just use almost like a mask, although it can be a little easier to work with than a mask. So we could use this to darken some of the areas in between the panels, adding a little bit more dimension. I'm going to turn on stroke, and we have black for the fill type. I'm going to turn down the opacity amount, just to add a nice edge and separation between the panels, but not imply any sort of depth. Although it does kind of create that illusion, it is not based on any specific lighting, so it'll work overall with the texture. We could do an inner shadow and have that go throughout the entire panel if we wanted. Depending on how big of an area you're going to be using this on, you might not want to create anything too unique, at least for any specific part of your layer, because what can happen is you're really going to see the tiling effect. And now we are tiling the texture, and that's the intent. But the tiling effect is when you're really seeing those repeated values, something that just stands out and you can see it repeated over and over. Of course, you can also use alphas with this as well, having different overlays to help separate that. So I'm going to turn off the distance, and we're just going to go around the edges, set that to linear burn, turn down the opacity. Actually, we'll go ahead and try the color burn, which is going to make what's already a higher amount of depth increased and add variation, but not too much variation. So we've already added a lot more just using that layer. And overall, the texture is looking pretty good so far. Although there is another technique we can use to really increase the complexity and basically just the coolness of the texture. And it's going to involve designing a shape layer we're going to be using to cut out some of our layers. What we can do in this case is use it on this new panel layer we've created. And to help achieve this a little better, I'm going to go into the layer style once again and turn on the color overlay. So now the fill, which is set to 0%, is entirely controlled by this color overlay. Or we could use a gradient overlay, really whatever you want. Set this to a color overlay. So now any blend mode we want to use between this color, and really I don't have any color right now, so it might be a good idea to start using some colors. I'm going to use sort of a yellowish, more desaturated color, but still just giving a slight hint. And that way, if we want to manipulate it later, we have some separation between the black and white and the colored areas. So the blend mode is going to work just like the other ones do, except it's affecting the color overlay, and we're just using the layer style for that. We could set this to color, which is going to just color the areas and not have any sort of intense effect. Overlay will really increase the amount, but still give us a nice blend. So we could separate it that way. Darker color is going to overwrite some of the current depth information, so whether or not you want to separate that, entirely up to you. And once again, if you want, you can just go through all the different modes. Always a good idea. Linear burn, as we can see, creates a very dark surface, but really neat looking. It doesn't blend well with the rest of it, but for the most part, it looks pretty good. So you can go through, try different things out, see what's going to work, whether or not you want something that is going to level out the contrast, as we can see with the hard light mode, or whether or not you want the contrast to remain the same with the overlay. So I'm going to use the hard light mode and making sure that we're not messing up the inner shadow too much. I'm going to go ahead and decrease the opacity, the size, slightly adjust the choke. Our stroke, I'm going to increase the opacity just a little bit. This stroke amount is going to become really important with the next step we're doing. I am going to reduce its size down to 1, and then click OK. So if you want to add another color to the background as well, you could double click, go to layer style, do a color overlay, and keeping in mind this will affect the entire document because our other layers do have opacity amounts that are blending. So we'll set this to, let's go ahead and do a linear burn. Just try that out, and it looks like that's probably going to be a little too dark. We're going to set it to more of a green hue. and it's going to blend and multiply with the other layer, but still give us a nice separation, something that looks a little bit better. So now we're going to create basically an object we can use to cut out pieces of these panels or any layer you're using, and it gives more of a circuitry type look. It also works well with modifying colors. So let's go ahead and just get started on that. I'm going to create a new layer and fill this with a black background. And then since we're going to be using the shape tool to start, it'll create our new layer from that. So we'll select the shape tool, just going to use the rectangle, change our color to white, and just draw out a box. Now we can right mouse click, rasterize the layer, right mouse clicking on the layer. And the black layer is really just to separate the shape layer we're working on, just so we can see it a little bit better. We won't be using it for anything other than to cover up the background. And this way we're just staying in the same document, although you can use the same document or a different document, new document, go back to the other one, really up to you. What I want to do is select the Marquee Tool, just the rectangular Marquee Tool, and start cutting out sections of the box. So we can just go around and create some different patterns and styles, just kind of going through and cropping this out. This is also pretty useful for interface design for websites. You can create some pretty neat looking surfaces this way. Just going through, having some overlaps and areas that match up a little bit better. Basically because these straight lines going through aren't going to give a very realistic look, so it's a good idea to break them apart and create separations that way. We also want to make sure we're creating lots of little details everywhere throughout the shape. Now we're going to be completely modifying this, and this is really just the starting layer for a sequence of several layers that will come out of it. So we're setting up the main design layer. We also want to make sure that we don't have this box look. So I'm going to just kind of cut out these edges. And add a little bit more of the detail. So I'm not going to go too in-depth recording basically all of these changes. So let's go ahead and hop to the next portion of this, which is going to be angling a lot of the corners to really increase the complexity and style. What I want to do is draw out just a rectangle box holding down the Shift key to make it a uniform box. Then what I want to do is right mouse click and transform the selection, making sure you're not free transforming, but transforming just the selection. Hold down Shift again, and we're going to drag it to a 45-degree angle. Then you can hit Enter, and now select the box and move it around to cut out some of the corners. If you're working with a larger selection and near the edge of the document, it's a good idea, and you always want to make sure that you're selecting the selection within the document and not outside the document, because that will deselect it. So we can just undo that. We could also add sort of this shape inside, cutting out some areas, but not creating anything that's really going to stand out Even though we will be manipulating this a very large degree, changing the scale, overlaying it to get an interesting surface. So you can just kind of play around with it, cut out some of these areas, really making sure that we don't have too many square corners, but also not too many that are rounded as well. And that'll just give us a nice circuitry look once we start to overlay. So I'm going to just work on this a little bit more, make it a little more complex, and then we can start to manipulate it before applying it to the panels. And this is what I've ended up with after removing a lot of areas. One thing I really wanted to make sure I was doing was removing the really large white blocks from the shape, because we don't want to have really huge sections because it's not going to work very well while we're overlaying, because once we start manipulating the texture and creating our duplicates, we're going to end up with some larger areas from that. So we don't need to have them within the main shape. I also made sure that there wasn't too many areas around the edges that match up. If we use a guide, just dragging from the rulers, we can see that most of the end pieces will not completely match up. Some of them do, but for the most part, I wanted to create as much variation as possible. And also have a lot of fine detail. So I did spend some time zooming into the document and just kind of cutting out some of the pieces and adding in lines in between some of the sections. And that's really going to help pull out the detail with this next part we're about to work on. So now we have this main shape. Whenever you create a shape like this, it's always a good idea to save it. You can always come back to it later. If you want to reuse it, I'm going to create a duplicate within the document. Just turn that off and drag it to the bottom just so we have that saved. What I'm going to do now is create another duplicate and hit Control-T for transform, making sure you're using a tool that will allow you to do that, which is basically the Marquee Tool. And what you can do is flip it horizontally or vertically. If you're looking for more of a symmetrical pattern, flipping it vertically or horizontally and just doing one or the other will give you a completely symmetrical pattern. So I'm just going to kind of scale this, move it off to the side, and overlay it. What you could also do is cut out some of the sections if you don't want to have too many parts repeating. But it's also a good idea just not to spend too much time on it, just because we will end up with a more complex version as we continue to create copies. Another thing you can do is create duplicates or new shape layers and blend those together. What I like to do when I'm working on a very large set of textures like this, create 10 or 12 shapes to start out with, like the first shape we made, and then use those to mix and blend together. And that goes the same for the rest of the document too. For these panels we have, creating several different base layers and panel layers really will help you. And in this case, it's not a super complex texture. Before applying these shapes, I would typically have something a little more complex than this and different variation on the two layers. Just to keep the training a little bit shorter, I'm just going to stick with the layers I currently have. But of course, the more complex of an image you have, the more realistic, at least in some cases. If you go overboard with it, it might not work so well. What you can also do if you're using the Move tool is holding down the Alt key on the keyboard and moving it. The layer will automatically create a duplicate. So sometimes it's a little easier and faster to create duplicates that way. Now you can see in the area where we have a lot of overlaps, we're starting to get those large white filled in areas, and that's not a bad thing. It's just one thing we wanted to avoid with the main layer since we're creating so many duplicates. What you can also do at this point is merge all of those together, create a copy, and start to mix that, changing the scale and creating a lot of detail. And we'll just go ahead and flip that horizontally, scale that down. Just go ahead and crop out some of those areas, just cutting them. So you can really go to any extent you want with it. Even using these layers themselves and these shapes to create your textures can be done. Rather than cutting out a layer, you could either make a mask from this, or you could set up layer styles and really drastically change the look between the two textures. We could add a color overlay and blend those together. Another thing that helps is actually what we're going to do is go to that color overlay and change the color slightly so that we have different overlapping areas. And this would be something you would do for using these shapes as the main part of the texture. What I'm going to do is just stick with what we currently have. I'm going to clear the layer style by right mouse clicking on the layer. And if you want, you can create duplicates of these layers as well to save for later. And we could just move this around. If it's a little too complex, too jumbled, you can move it to an area where it's not going to have such an impact, removing all the detail, or maybe not create so many different shapes. And that's really up to you. So I'm going to merge these down. We can turn off that black layer. And what I'm going to do is use this white shape we just created with the magic wand tool, and we can select the shape, and then really depending on the tolerance you have, some of the finer details may not come out of it just because they might be too small, down to a pixel. Even a lot of them will be removed if you scale it too much. I'm going to reduce the tolerance to 5. And if I do that, we're going to lose a bit more of the finer details. If you're using the anti-alias mode, that will also change. If we increase it to 50 and now select, we'll be able to pick up some more of those detailed areas, but not everything. But it's still going to look really good overall. So what we can do now is just turn off the layer, and we have our selection. We want to switch to the Marquee Tool, making sure we're not using the Move tool. If we use the Move tool, it's going to move the pieces. And if that's what you're looking for, then by all means do it. You can get some interesting effects that way. But what I want to do is just kind of cut it. So we're going to select our panel layer. And when you're hovering over the document or over the selection, you need to make sure that you can see the icon for the marquee and not your normal cursor or the brush, really depending on what you have your settings at. Because that way we're moving the selection, otherwise we'll end up deselecting it. So let's just bring this over to a piece of the panel, and this is going to cut out a very large area. So if you want to use a smaller selection, that might be more beneficial. But we can just go through here and cut out different parts. And as you can see, when I'm outside the document bounds, we are not able to see the icon, so that means we cannot select selection. It will deselect. So we just want to make sure we're grabbing it from that layer. You could just hit delete on the keyboard. I'm going to undo that one. Bring this over. Cut this out. So it really depends on, of course, what you're looking for. But this is just kind of a neat way to create these detailed shapes. If you need to, you can zoom out. And another thing you can do is transform this selection, changing its scale, its shape, to manipulate it even more. So I'm going to grab the selection, move it to the document, right mouse click, transform the selection, and this time I'm going to really scale it down. Hit enter. I'm also going to just go back and rotate it using shift to keep it square unless you wanted to have some angles in there. But that's one of the reasons why I was cutting out the sides before. So creating multiple layers with these cutouts can create some really interesting surfaces. And you can see all those little detail amounts that are coming out and really working with the layer style to create something really interesting. So if we go back to the layer style, and maybe we want to decrease the size of the drop shadow, remove the distance, increase our spread, we can create a little bit of a better separation, really depending on what you're looking for, as usual. Go back to the stroke, and if we increase the scale, we can see how that really manipulates the layer a little too much. With the outside mode, you're going to get a lot of rounding. Center mode, it is reduced. It will start to also go into the texture and into the layer. Another cool thing you can do is change the stroke color. And that way you could create lights, maybe adjust the opacity and just have it very subtle. It's also going to pull out a lot of the little bits and pieces we have. We could change that to more of an orangish yellow glow. Lighten that up, maybe pick one of the colors from the document. So of course there's a lot we can do with it. We could change the blend mode to a linear burn, or we could use the color burn, which is going to be more varied. And you can just see we can end up with some really interesting looking surfaces and textures this way. So the more layers we have and cutting out different portions allows us to stack them on top of each other and really create some neat variations. We could go back and grab that other layer. We could cut out of this as well. And if we create different base layers, throw them on top, cut those pieces out, it really could be an endless process. So you might want to watch out for that, making sure you're not spending too much time when one layer change or layer style change can completely manipulate the document. But in this case, what we could also do, and we're basically done here, but I'm going to just create a duplicate of the current state, merge this down, and now creating another layer. Go to the Move tool, setting the difference mode, and now nudging this slightly, we can see an entirely different type of surface forming. And this one looks a little more alien, but we get some good detail out of it. So you could pick out pieces this way. You could maybe use your bump map from this sort of a blend. Also remembering too, going through different layer styles can help give you different textures. You could free transform the document, and with the Marquee Tool, you could flip it horizontally, flip it vertically, rotate it 90 degrees, set it to overlay, and now we have even more detail, something a little more dirtied up, but we can add much more to the texture this way. Go ahead and double click on the layer to open the layer style, and then we can choose maybe a different color or even a different shade, intensity, saturation value than the current color. Pick your mode you want to use over the top of it, and you can get something very interesting that way. So even this itself could be a base layer for another texture. We could take this, bring it back to the other layer that we had, and basically that first base layer we created, and put the other one on top of it and start cutting away from this on top of this. So really a lot we can do with it, get some really neat effects, and it's just kind of a neat technique to create science fiction textures. Now, because of the movement we have in the layers, we will need to slightly crop the image. If you want to start out with something a little higher than 1024 by 1024, so that you have crop room, you could give yourself a little bit of a bleed edge, normally around 30 to 40 pixels all the way around. What you could also do is just scale it. That can also help increase the variation between the surfaces, but keeping in mind that it will resample the image slightly. So you will have to pay attention to, under Edit Preferences, the image interpolation type. Basically the recommended settings, or what it's recommending for each setting, is pretty much straightforward. So if you are enlarging, bicubic smoother might work. If you are going to be reducing, you can get some sharper pixels from using bicubic sharper. I'm using bicubic mode. I'm going to go ahead and switch to bilinear, which really isn't going to make huge changes. It's a little more straightforward. So we could either scale the document that way, but what I'm going to do is just flatten it or merge the two together and just run a crop on the inside of the document. And now if we want to make this seamless, because right now it's not going to be seamless at all, we can go up to Filter, Other, select Offset, and if we take a look, we can really see the seam showing up. So we would want to either design a custom brush to clone stamp this, or we could basically copy pieces or areas of the image and paste that, and then go back and use our shape that we originally created to cut all this out, and just cut the edges out around the seams. So there's a lot of different ways to deal with that. For the most part, because we worked with everything being mostly square and making sure we had 45-degree angles for our cuts, it's going to be really easy to create a seamless texture out of this. And we can already see that the seams, although they do show up, it's not something really obvious as it would be with other types of textures because of our